Yeah, look, you're right to remind us about all the sort of the intellectual capital that's been taken out, the leadership capital of the Iranian regime, and not just obviously these physical assets over some time. So assuming all of that, right, how long would it take if they were determined to restart the program? How long would it take them to get back where they were a couple of weeks ago?
Well, it's a really interesting question, and again, certainly the intelligence community will be really focused on understanding that. Part of that answer will be whether or not Iran's allies, to include Russia, the Chinese, and to some extent the North Koreans, are willing to transfer that technology back into Iran to give them those key ingredients to recommence that process. It is true, and if you look at the relationship between Iran and Russia, for example, in terms of technology transfers, UAVs, unmanned aerial systems from Iran into Russia, and then the quid pro quo, which might be the export of a centrifuge, for example, out of Russia back into Iran, I think the time that it will take Iran to recommence their plan will be largely dependent on how willing their allies are to assist them in so doing.
All right, let's go into Europe and look at the NATO meeting, because if someone had said to me, gosh, even 4 or 5 years ago, that we'd get NATO up to 5%, that's been a long, not just a Trump view, a long-held view of the United States. To get there, Spain to one side last night with a near unanimous vote, I think is extraordinary. What do you make of that spending commitment?
It absolutely is extraordinary, and I think it's a symptom of just how much the world has changed, and that we have lived really since the end of the Cold War through what many describe as a peace dividend, which is now over. And in fact, that national security and the use of war as an instrument in the international system is very much a feature of 2025 moving forward. And that reflects a decision by most of the NATO members to lift their spending in line with the announcements overnight. President Trump certainly has been the catalyst to exact that commitment from his NATO partners. And there's nothing more that focuses the mind than the war in Ukraine as it relates to European security, and the reality that their own self-reliant self-defence is very much an obligation not only to the alliance and to a lesser extent the US, but actually to their own civilian populations. As we're reminded back here, the first and most significant duty of a government is to protect its people.
Right, I want to ask you about China, but I want to go back into that defence question, because when you listen to the federal government now, Minister Miles in particular, the Minister for Defence, he talks about our quantum of spending, and at best in a decade we'll be at 2.33, we're around 2% now. A lot of that is an accounting trick because it's a bring forward of money to pay for submarines in the nearer term. It's not all the other defence capability. So I want to get your view on, are we spending enough? And if you were the Minister for Defence, where would you say the money needs to be spent right now? What capability are we missing? What do we need?
Well, I think in the broader public debate, one of the challenges we have in this country is that the debate around defence spend is always relative to what we have either previously spent or what another form of government has spent. And of course, what is absent is the question around whether the spend is appropriate relative to the threat. Now, it's one thing to have an investment program that will deliver important capabilities in the early part of next decade, and I would applaud that. It's another, however, to make a diagnosis of the international system and think about what we might need to get us to the arrival of those systems. So what are, as I like to call, the fight tonight capabilities that we need to ensure our preparedness, for example, between 2025 and 2030? And in relation to that, although much of those government announcements around increased spending are in the planned budget, they are in the out of the years. They are in the back end of the decade. And I would submit to you that more needs to be done now so that we can manage the contingencies and risks that are likely to appear in our region between now and the arrival of things like AUKUS submarines.
Okay, just quickly, China. I mean, how real is a threat? We hear of 2027, we hear of Xi's own personal timetable. How real is the China and Taiwan threat?
Well, the Chinese political rhetoric is clear vis-à-vis Taiwan. President Xi has said as much in all of his proclamations and party Congress announcements. And in other forms of Chinese statecraft, we're seeing what would traditionally constitute hostile acts to include what's happening in cyber and threats to critical infrastructure. and indeed what's happening in what many call the grey zone. So if you're to make a strategic calculus around how China is talking vis-a-vis Taiwan, its ambitions and what it's actually doing in those non-traditional elements of warfare, I think you'd have to come to a judgment that the security situation is at risk and therefore Australia needs to plan accordingly.
Thank you very much for that. We'll speak again.